Welcome to Surviving Society.
Welcome to another episode of Surviving Society. Our collaboration with Maslaha is currently in progress. We are in the studio today with Raheel and Patrick. Hi, guys.
Hey, Chantal.
Sorry, I just want to say, it's been a while since I've done an episode with just men.
But we're not just any men, though.
No, you're not just any men. Exactly. I wouldn't just have any men, but it's just all men in the room right now, and it hasn't been like this for a while.
That's not cool,
Why
is
is
it?
George laughing so much?
I thought she was looking at me. I thought she was going to go for just 4 men. Yeah. Thinking, hold on. But, yeah.
Oh no, thank you so much for joining us today, guys. We've been doing this series about Muslims in and out of prisons, focusing on the incredible work of Maslaha, but locally, but also thinking nationally about other people that are doing really important work around prison, abolition, families and communities. Before we get into the subject matter today, just to say Patrick is an absolute legend, and it's so great to have you in the studio, Patrick. I can't believe this is the first time I'm meeting you in person, because I've been I've been really inspired by how you've been able to be an academic that is engaged in community work in such a meaningful way. And your work has been a huge inspiration for me, and I know many within across generations as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much for saying that. It's really appreciated. And kind of embarrassing as well.
Is it?
Yeah,
Why?
yeah.
Why is it embarrassing?
It's embarrassing because essentially we're doing the work, ain't we?
Yeah.
I guess we have a purpose and we engage in that purpose. And once we're doing the work, I don't often look back on it and think about, okay, this was really cool and this is the impact it's having. You're almost driven by necessity to do what we're doing. But it's really appreciated when people come back and acknowledge the work that me and other colleagues and also communities are engaged with. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
It's an absolute pleasure. And I really like that you started with the word purpose, because part of my thing is that everyone should have the space to pursue whatever their purpose is in life. And I guess just to start with and to introduce the listeners that might not necessarily know your work, Patrick, what has been your purpose?
Thank you. I started from, and it's in terms of context and a bit of a biography as well. I came out of university. I didn't come out of university. I came out of university, and I was always interested in this notion of research. It sounds bizarre. Research, knowledge production, understanding. I recall, it's going to sound really bizarre going backwards, but I remember reading an article by Chuck D from Public Enemy, who spoke about if we want to try and affect change, then we have to recognise that those in positions of power have researchers, they have policymakers, they have resources to build this information and knowledge, which is what's used against black communities. And I remember reading it because I was a big hip-hop freak at the time and thought, right, I'm really interested in this knowledge. And we're writing, as a kid, you're writing lyrics and we're thinking about this notion of knowledge and knowledge production. And I think that's what motivated me to go to university and do research. So I did a social science degree. I was interested in research methodology. Not many people know that I left university and then became a research and evaluation officer within the probation service.
Oh, wow.
So I had that applied context where I was looking at data sets and information and almost cutting my teeth in terms of how we begin to build constructs, ideas, the framing around different groups and individuals. So I'd sit every day and my job was, okay, how many people are on probation? What are the characteristics or traits of these individuals? I'd have managers who were interested in, okay, well, what do we need to do with these individuals? And often it didn't make any sense to me. I guess it's from that position that I began to write and began to do some work around. At that time, it was how do we intervene with black and Asian people on probation? I was like, what the hell? But that was a question that we were asked to explore. And I began to push back on that very quickly because there were tropes, narratives, discourses about black communities, black and Asian communities, which didn't fit with my understanding of those communities, of my experiences within those communities. And I guess it was in that moment I began to think about, we need to begin to push back on some of this, begin to disrupt this. Long story short, and we can get back into that in a little more detail. I then went to university. And whilst that afforded a wider space for me to begin to reflect on the areas I was interested in, there were still barriers and constraints in terms of how we engage in the work. However, it afforded this space for me to begin to disrupt gang narratives. So one of the early pieces of work, we were sent to an area in Greater Manchester because they had an emerging gangs problem. And given my position and knowing the area, I just thought, nah, this doesn't make sense. So it was that ability to begin to push back, begin to use data, those experiences, those skills, as a way of countering those emergent narratives. I guess once I'd undertaken that piece of work, then that led very quickly to the work around being matrixed. So the experience of black men in London who were on the gangs matrix, and almost taking an opportunity to foreground their experiences and their narratives of what this meant and what this represented. And then the joint enterprise work very quickly. So around the same time, picked up on that. So we wrote Dangerous Associations, Joint Enterprise, Gangs and Racism. And essentially that body of work came from that curiosity, my discomfort with the narratives that were being presented around communities. And I think still exists, that discomfort at those narratives, and how do we build counters to try and disrupt those narratives.
Just for a little bit of myth busting, Patrick, and thank you so much for sharing that introduction to your work and how you came to be. But for the listeners again, myth busting, what is the gangs matrix?
Good question. It's a really good question. The gangs matrix is a really hyped up term which is given to a database spreadsheet of individuals who the Metropolitan Police believe to be gang suspects or people who are involved in gang behaviour. Now, we know there were problematic discourses around what is the definitions of a gang, but essentially this database, I think when we first started looking at it, there were about 3,250 individuals on there. Essentially, it was just a list of names broken down by boroughs across London where, and it's gang nominals, it's a gang suspect. So we have individuals whose details are recorded and then they become subject to surveillance, monitoring, policing. Their data is shared across agencies because of the language of risk. They're deemed to be at risk and therefore the police legitimately intervene in the lives of these individuals as a result of them being recorded onto this database. The amnesty work and the B Matrix work that we did on behalf of Stopwatch clearly showed that there were individuals on there who'd never committed offences, individuals who were associated to gang-affected areas, individuals who may have friends who may be similarly labelled as gang members, but essentially the label itself, in and of itself, the gang label was so problematic that you just have these individuals who are subjected to being policed on this basis of being matrixed. The work we did was that we spoke to individuals about their experience of being matrixed. I remember asking one individual, each of the individuals, how many times you've been stopped and searched? And it was always met with a laugh. Almost, how can you even be asking that question? And this lad said 200 times, 300 times. One kid said it's got to be 1,000 times. We began to build analysis that said, look, these individuals are living in a police state. Those estates had become police states where they were just subject to this over-policing. There were kids who were kicked out of school because they were thought to pose a risk to other children in the schools. We heard of mothers who had to leave their homes because their children posed a risk to other individuals. So whilst you've got this data in this spreadsheet, this benign tool, and I often try to caricature it as a spreadsheet, it has profound harms for those individuals whose names were registered onto that database. And through the great work, the incredible work of organisations like Unjust, the work of Tottenham Rights and Stafford Scott, they worked to get that disbanded, in essence, overturned, so they no longer use that database. I guess one of my concerns around that, however, was that it wasn't disbanded or broken because it was a racist tool. It's because the data was being shared across agencies. So in essence, we need to be able to call out racism when it's racist. And this was a racist tool and strategy as a way of trying to regulate and control young black and brown folks, women communities. But essentially, they wiggle off the hook by saying, no, the problem was essentially the sharing of data across agencies, which is equally harmful. So we have to acknowledge that as well. But that's the matrix in a nutshell. It's no longer there.
That's such a good description, like so clear. And I feel like I've even just learned more about the matrix listening to you, Patrick. Thank you so much. I mean, it never stops feeling just so shocking hearing about the way the police, criminal justice system and the state more broadly monitor minoritized groups and black and brown people, particularly young people. Like, no matter how many times we do episodes on this, it never stops like infuriating me, because like we're in London right now, and about 10 minutes in a taxi you got the city of London. The amount of drugs in that area, the amount of drugs, the amount of quote unquote crime going on, and like it just doesn't get, it's just so racist, basically. The mistreatment, the hierarchy of who deserves human status. Yeah, it's just, it never stops surprising me and shocking me, and I guess that's part of what drives us, isn't it?
Absolutely. And therein lies the tension as well, because essentially those who are stopped and searched and subject to policing and the criminal legal system of England and Wales are held up symbolically as a cause of crime within contemporary society. And it serves a function, doesn't it? Yeah, the narratives around black communities as criminal, Muslim communities as at risk of radicalisation and extremism serves a function.
Yeah.
And that function is simply that we can sidetrack attention away from those who cause the most harms in society onto those groups who are perceived as outsiders, as not belonging. There's a political strategy there, and that's what's playing out in that moment. It's incredible. I guess for me as well, and it'd be really interesting to talk about in a bit more detail, is how we don't push back enough on those narratives. That reality that you've just spoken to, we know this, but we often don't push on that and use evidence or data to demonstrate how that takes place and why it takes place. It's insane. So we accept the narrative of black and brown communities as criminalised, and we use the language of masculinity as a way of explaining why this is so. And I was just thinking through some of the figures again. I don't want to sound like a nerd throughout this.
We love it's just a nerd safe space.
And we talk about, 88,000 people now in prisons. A nerd what space?
Nerd safe space.
And then we talk, it's insane because we talk about 88,000 people in prisons today. 27% of prison population made up of racial minoritized people. So how many people we talk about? 20 odd thousand people. Yeah. If we talk about the black community, you talk about 10,500 people across England and Wales who are in prison. But somehow we, collectively as academics or as communities or as a criminal legal system, hold up that 10,500 people in a population of how many million and present them as a crime problem. It's insane. It's insane. And we now need to begin to contextualise, be more curious. I'm always worried that we use the state's figures to try and call out racism. The police stop and search 6 and 7 times more likely.
Who's collecting that data?
Figures.
That's their data. That's their data.
We're using that data to cite it back to them as a way of demonstrating the problems and challenges. That feels out of kilter. We need to generate a different form of knowledge. I'm looking at you here, Raheel.
Yeah.
A different way in which we speak.
Raheel, come on, please, can you fix this?
It's that thing of like basically saying, like, you're right, like by using that data, we're trying to sort of say, this is our humanity, but we're saying that to the white racists who are never going to accept that. But this is the other thing about like data just being really, those figures don't tell the whole story, right? Like it's just such a massive gap of like that experience of what it means. Like, and you've done this work, Patrick, around what does it actually feel like to be stopped by a policeman, like on the streets, and there are other people watching you, and you're not quite sure what the next few minutes are going to look like, or the next like hour or 2 hours. Like, what are your parents going to think, or your family or carers? Like all of that kind of decontextualizing of like that harm is the thing that makes me really angry in the kind of standard reports that we see from government, and let's be honest here, from like academics and like the charity sector as well. And like I think we do need to have a counter to that, which is kind of what we're trying to do, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, But it's like that building that momentum. And I don't know, there's also a thing of like, how do you build like a community of like practice and learning? You know, which I think about you, because like you take the kind of your skills and expertise and you go into community, right? And you're like, the skills that I have and the knowledge and expertise that exists within communities already, like how do you marry those two things to start to build that counter?
The reality is it's not going into community. That's the problem of the academic. They go into communities, they work in an extractive way. They go into take, so they begin to feed the academy, the institution, the higher education institution. And I still have this notion of being of, not notion, I'm of community. Got 8 brothers and 1 sister. I grew up in
you're 1 of 9.
Yeah, I grew up in 1 of 10.
1 of 10.
I grew up in Old Trafford. See, this is why some folks don't get the data. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm 1 of 10. So I grew up in Old Trafford within that community. I went to school with my buddies, my mates. That's who we are, essentially. And it's recognising that there is knowledge produced within communities. So how do we emphasise that? How do we give voice to that? How do we foreground those narratives, those stories, those experiences within the work that we're doing? Because in the absence of that, we leave a vacuum. We leave a void, and that will invariably always be filled by the state. So the state will tell us about knife crime, in gangs, and county lines, and grooming. And they're the concerns that, therefore, those racialised tropes are the ones that become imposed on us. We have to, therefore, begin to push back against those tropes. And by speaking to folks, by being embedded within community, by utilising what we have and working in service to and with community, then we're more able to surface those narratives and those stories. For an example, I spoke to one young person who said he was stopped by the police, and what he had was, I've spoken about this before, you know the razors, pencil sharpener, and you got the little razor on the pencil sharpener. He had one of those in his pockets for cutting up weed. Yeah, so when he could cut up his weed and then build a spliff. He got pulled by the police and he had it in his pocket. He has a knife crime conviction against him for possession of that razor blade. And there's something really interesting in the discourse around knife crime is such that we automatically assume that somebody convicted of a knife crime offence may have a zombie knife. In essence, it can be a range of different tools, but the discourse and the narrative is racialised. That says the individual who may be smoking a spliff can also be convicted of a knife crime offence. We need to look at those figures and disrupt those figures and disrupt those narratives.
Sorry, I'm really coming for the middle classes today,
Yeah,
and it's the multi-ethnic middle class. But when you're talking about like someone that's effectively got a DIY grinder and that they now have a knife crime conviction for that. And I know, many of you know that listening to this episode now, middle class people that have they've got their little kits that you can buy online that are like their little like bespoke, like, no judgment at all. But like people really take pride in how they put their drugs together. And like, it's just mad how class this all is, because they're not getting a conviction. Like the way they're able to move through the world that allows for kind of respectability around drug possession and spliff smoking. Like it's just crazy how unfair it is.
It's insane how unfair it is. I was speaking to one of my students recently, teaching master's level. I hope I'm not going too far with this. I'm teaching the student, white middle class student.
Yeah.
And she literally speaks about, so she brought drugs through the airport. And she sat down there telling me.
That'd be muling.
Well, she's telling me, she's literally saying, but Patty, I know because of my whiteness that I'm not going to be stopped coming through. She knows
Where's
this.
the lie?
She knows this. And we sat down in a group and having this conversation, but it's the truth. We know this. And that's how this plays out. You sat down there, and on one level, I want to be upset about this. I was going to swear then.
Yeah.
But then on the next level, she's coming from a position of, this is the truth. And then you think about, is it Kojo's work? Kojo Karam's work, and you think about the work that Tanzo Chowdhury's done. And their analysis on how this is taking place.
The drug
How
stuff is
the
wild.
policing of Notting Hill for drugs and the policing of Glastonbury and the Tea Party.
Yeah.
And how you have these strategies of testing people's drugs before they go into the festival to make sure they're clean drugs, whereby we're getting banged up preemptively before the festival takes place.
Meanwhile,
It's
my
insane.
guy's getting a conviction for pencil sharpener.
Pencil sharpener.
It's just
Come on.
Look at us looking at Real. We're looking at Real like, okay, Real, can you just like sort this out, please?
this is way above my pay grade.
It's not.
It's not. It's a recognition of how the systems works, isn't it? It's a record, and we know this. In communities, we know this. We're speaking about this all the time. Why is this, and how? But for us and for me, what's interesting is it's now for us to begin to explain the how. We've always been good at talking about racism and foregrounding institutional and systemic racism, and I get that. But for me and for my students and for those researchers within communities, let's begin to talk about the modality.
Yeah,
How does this take place?
It's just the race. Talking about the racism stuff now. I don't want to use. I'm bored of it. I'm not bored of it because I don't want to. I am bored of it, but I don't mean that in terms of like it's not important. It's like you say, Patrick. It's the how now. Okay, how are we shifting things? How are we changing things? And there's obviously loads of people that are doing that work, but I do feel like so often the only way our story we get humanized within the media or within academia is by talking about racism, rather than how we kind of shift these things. Is that kind of what you mean?
It's how I mean it, but it's also what is the modality of injustice?
Okay.
How does this take place within the criminal legal system as well? What are the apparatus and the ways of working which result in now over 50% of young people in YOIs, children and young people, are now from a racially minoritized background? How does that happen? And we can say it's racism. No. I want to know the precise decision making of practitioners, those assessments, those constructions of risk and riskiness, which results in children and young people being placed in a YOI. I want to know what that practitioner was thinking when they felt there was some evidence recently came out of the YJB that says that practitioners are assessing these children as at risk of violence and therefore remanding them into custody. How can remanding a child into custody be seen as a positive outcome? It can only be harmful. But essentially the tropes around young black people within certain communities are what are driving that practitioner's assessment of what is risky. So we need to get into the assessments and we need to get to those practitioners who are making those decisions which result in the incarceration of children and young people. We need to think about how do the police and CPS defend a decision that results in 12 people being convicted for an offence, 12 individuals being convicted. Who's making those decisions? What was the charging decision between the police and the CPS that says, yes, go for all 12? We know who the individual was who caused the harm, but how do they defend that decision?
Yeah.
Isn't that also to do with, like, I'm just thinking about, and Chantal, I know you gave a talk about this, so you probably can like be more authoritative on this, but like around like Stuart Hall's idea of like that conjunctural analysis and policing the crisis. So he was looking at how the moral panic around muggings was transplanted from the US to the UK. There was like this weird sort of like the police, judiciary and the media at the same time kind of developing this kind of moral panic about just groups of young black people, right? So I'm just thinking in those moments where we have the police or the CPS or like the magistrates, like there's almost like this kind of bank of like, it's like a bank of like images and ideas that have developed of like the young black boy who listens to certain types of music, like the young Muslim man who's got a beard. And wait a minute, we had like the War on Terror and 9/11. And then before that we had, Claire Alexander spoke about this, the kind of, in quotes, race riots in like Oldham and like in Bradford and stuff. But all of that's almost like, it's just sitting there in people's heads.
Yeah.
And then it's almost like activated. Do you know what I mean? And then that's the other element of,
There's something about it being tied into the corporate memory of these institutions, that corporate memory. So essentially you talk about this bank, and I think you're absolutely right. but I also think it's ingrained in there.
Yeah.
So they already know us. They think they know us. And I think that's what sits to the fore of this. So when I walk into that room, that construction, that corporate memory, almost goes in ahead of me.
Yeah.
They know who they're seeing when I sit down. They know who you are when you sit down. And that's what informs those assessments. Yeah. And then we can go back to those significant events, which almost mark these moments. We did it recently for a project, Harm to Healing, where we plotted these significant events, which almost demonstrate our community memory of the harms that have been experienced, the deaths in custody, yeah, the beatings and the killings, but then also how that sits within their corporate memory. All these individuals are responsible for these. And that's that conjunctural analysis, but we can take it higher as well. So we talk about Islamophobia before 9/11. I had a colleague who wrote a paper, Australian colleague, who went all the way back to the satanic verses and how that was presented as constructing this discourse of Muslims as irrational. Yeah. That goes back years. That's before 9/11, that we've always had these discourses and these constructs around particular groups. And that's what's important for us to historicise those figures. Because what happens with those figures when we read statistics on race in the criminal justice system, or we read Bromley briefing papers, which are really valuable documents, but essentially they are dehistoricised.
Yeah.
They do not speak about that longer history, which drives up our encounters with the police and wider criminal legal system. How can we make sense of what's happening to John in this moment without looking back at that history of police in these very same community? And that's why that historicisation becomes really important, and the context within which policing takes place.
Because otherwise what you'll have is the response will be, we just need more culturally diverse like training.
Mate, don't get me started on that.
I was just going to say as well, like coming on to the kind of conjunctural analysis, like, and thinking about police in the crisis, Raheel, as you said, like one thing that I've been thinking about, and I think we've spoken about it on the show a couple of times, is like, would Stuart Hall have been able to foresee that people like you and I, or that look like us or from our backgrounds, would become part of the state collaborators, would become part of like the mouthpieces, the policy makers that would be enacting these racist policies? So it's like we've got a whole new layer of like what we're up against. Like we could be arguing for the humanity for Black and Muslim young people, whilst at the same time a politician who's Black or Muslim or both will say to us, what are you talking about? It's not true, it's not racist.
Yeah.
So it's like we've got this like other layer of harm that's making things even more difficult.
It's the kind of professional academic or charity person, right? That's in the rooms with the minister when they're having those round tables. Me and you have been in those rooms, right? And like we're like maybe one of two like Black or brown people around the table, and like, you know, you have the launch of like the Lammy Review and the Young Review, and people are like, you know, racism is bad, we've got to do stuff about it. Suddenly they're in this room with this white minister. You can't mention racism. What racism? Like, that's not polite.
No.
You can't mention that.
The R word.
Yeah. Like, and
What words I use instead? What prejudice? Unfair?
Disparities.
yeah.
Disparity.
Unexplained disproportionality.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's like, you know, you've got to make everything really polite.
Yeah.
It's like such a performance as well, you know, and then those people come out of that room and then they're right, we're like for the social good. And that is that, you're right, that's the other kind of layer of stuff that we have to kind of counter, I think.
I wish I'd brought this quote in with me. I was speaking to, I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago, and I held up one of the quotes again from being matrixed. And I asked one of the young men, what do you think is driving your experiences of being policed? And he literally speaks to me for about 2 minutes without mentioning racism. Young Black man. He's speaking about a particular experience where he was clocked on the streets by this white woman who we called in. When she walked past him, she pulled a handbag to herself, and he was obviously offended by that as a young person. But throughout what he was saying to me, he never mentioned the word racism. He kept referring to it. So he said, the thing is, you can't speak about it anymore because you're almost seen as being wrong for saying it. And therefore, because you can't say it, then, and I used it the other day in this presentation, calling it, because it's not just the ministers. Increasingly now, we feel unable to name racism. It's okay for Casey to do so, or Macpherson, or the head of Police Scotland to speak about institutional racism. But even within our communities, there are young people that we can't really talk about it anymore. That's harmful, because then you're left to labour and reflect on, well, why am I being treated this way? And when you can't frame it within that discourse of racism, and I know we're saying we don't, and I agree with you, but then how else do we understand that? And that's the urgency with which we need to be doing this work, building those counter-narratives, working with those individuals within communities to assist in making sense of how injustice is playing out within black and brown communities. The killing of a family member as a result of police institutional police violence, but we can't name racism as a feature of that, for fear that it will hinder the inquiry or the inquest. Wow. And that's where that counter becomes critical. We have to be able to surface, foreground our voices and our narratives so that we can begin to say, do you want this? One of the mothers said to me, they did this to my child because he was black. And she has to be able to say that confidently and not be held back. No, the sentences won't like that. The head of the inquiry won't like that. She has to be empowered to be able to say that with evidence, with knowledge, with data that says, this is exactly why. This happened to your child because he was black. And that's not to negate these things happening to white folk. Yeah, I'm not saying white folks don't experience injustice. What I'm saying is, in terms of understanding processes of criminalisation, the different ways in which people are constructed as criminal, we know there are particular ways and processes for young black and brown children and young people, in the same way that there are very different processes of criminalisation for women and girls who are embroiled in violent offences when they commit no violent offences. So it's recognising the different processes of criminalisation, but recognising that there's racialised criminalisation, which is what explains that overrepresentation within the criminal legal system.
We were having a conversation with somebody who'd been through the prison system like for a number of years, and he started off as a 15-year-old Muslim guy. He said that he was in his cell and he rang the bell and asked the prison officer for like a pen so he could write home to his family. And it took ages, like he didn't come back. Then the person next door to him rang the bell and just asked for a tissue and something came. And he was saying to us how really early on he started to realise how, okay, it's because I'm Muslim and it's because I'm brown. And then as he was an adult in the prison estate as well, and he started experiencing similar things. But you sort of realise how there's a kind of that experience of being in the prison system isn't kind of recorded anywhere. So we did this piece of work around the disproportionate use of pepper spray, and we showed like once it got introduced in 2018, 2019, the use of it has increased on Muslims and other communities like year on year. And that was through freedom of information requests. So parva spray is like a pepper spray. We've probably seen it now, like on the streets. Like if you think of like, it can like debilitate you. It can leave like quite long-standing injuries. So imagine having pepper spray used against you in a cell, and you can't go anywhere. You can't change your clothes because it sticks to your clothes. It's on your skin as well. And what's the thing that I think is really horrifying is that there are like regular chief inspector of prison reports on prisons that basically will say parva was used this many times. We found that the reasons they were used in the kind of use of false statements that are provided afterwards didn't provide an adequate reason for it to be used. Body cameras were off. Not enough was done to de-escalate before that moment. Or another example was of a prison officer saying that they were using parva spray in order to prevent self-harm. And the chief inspector of prison report is basically saying, we don't think that's correct. And you think to yourself, wait a minute. Like even in your own really crude collection of data, like you can see that this is a problem, that it's a pattern, right, across prisons, whether it's like with children in prison, being physically restrained, having pulver spray used against them, women in prison. There's a constant pattern of what they call those DIRFs. They're like discrimination incidents reports.
Yeah.
People not trusting them, them not being used,
using them.
not using them.
That's right.
So this is like a pattern that keeps, like you're like saying, Patrick, about the processes, and yet it almost gets like, it's almost frozen in those reports. Do you know what I mean? Like there's nowhere else for that to go afterwards. And for me, it's just almost unpacking the thing of, well, why did that prison officer use pulver spray in that moment? Like, was it just the argument that forensic architecture used with Mark Duggan? Was it a split-second decision?
Yeah.
Like, well, no, it's not.
No.
It's like years of like training and kind of cultural corporate memory, like literally in the DNA that builds up, and like, right, we're going to attack you, and then it kind of makes me think, well, all of these kind of mandatory guidelines, like the Royal Commission, the review, like they're useless, right? Like
it's about culture, isn't it? How do we shift the culture
and get that kind of like those sort of like almost without. I think that one of the things I really worry about is like the kind of like not turning individuals into case studies of like just trauma, because even in that situation they resist. And I'm just going to sort of shout out to Sadiya Hartman's book, because I know you love it so. Where like I kind of really like just learning about how like there is always resistance, because that's what we always do. And what does that resistance also look like? So the the Muslim man or Muslim woman who knows they will get punished for showing signs of religiosity will carry on still being, regardless of how the state might punish them. But I think that's the thing that I'm also like, we also try and grapple with, like in the space of a prison that is hidden, like getting in and then getting those stories out as well.
And you're cool at doing that. It's important to do that, isn't it? That reaching beyond through the prison gates, because my argument and my view is that these are community members, and we can no longer allow those bars to separate us from those community members. So what are the strategies and the ways in which we begin to reach through those gates, to have those conversations and to gather those testimonies and those stories of the proximity to the harm and violence of prison? But just also picking up on that point you were making, again, going back to that, the modality of injustice, then what is it in that moment? And you're absolutely right, there's that notion of escalating encounters is driven by the constructions of black and brown men as dangerous. It's risky. So we need to use pulver spray. We need to use the firearms. It's part of that corporate memory. That says we need to respond to this risk, this threat that's posed by these individuals. And sometimes it's about how do we manage and contain that risk in order to protect read white public. And therefore we can see that that violence is more likely to be trained and used on black and brown folk. And we see that play out historically. And that historical context is important, but also within this contemporary moment as well. And that's a framing we need to acknowledge, because you're absolutely right. For as long as we're going to protect the POA, are going to be protecting prison officers, or you've got, what's the police union called? Protecting officers. And essentially, well, there was a risk posed to our officers, and therefore they did what was necessary to protect themselves and their colleagues. That's the narrative. That's the defence against the violence that's used against our folks. So how then do we manage that? How do we begin to disrupt that? Is it simply about presenting arguments that black and brown folks are not risky? We know this. But how do we disrupt that corporate memory? Shift that corporate memory? Or do we just push away from it? Not engage with it? Because it's not there to assist us. It serves a function. It's a symbolic function.
It's also like the clues, right? Like there was the Justice Secretary at the time, Robert Buckland. He was like giving evidence to the Justice Select Committee, and he was basically saying, this was during COVID, like, it's almost like it's like an aside. He said, like, I've had lots of approaches from the Prison Officers Union that they want parva spray. And I didn't hear it properly the first time around, but then it makes you think, well, actually, the Prison Officers Union has access. Like, they're the kind, that's the group that he will listen to. They're quite powerful. So then it's that thing of, like, what are the different areas where you almost need to, like, intervene in and, like, take down.
But that power is really important, isn't it? And even back in my early career, the argument was that prisons was like that safety valve on the system.
Yeah.
So essentially, politicians relied on being able to put as many prisoners as they could in cells. And who would take the hit on that was the prison officers, because they then had to manage the overcrowding within prisons. And that becomes a machinery, because, well, you always won. We've carried this for years. In this moment now, we're overcrowded in prisons. Yeah. This new government has to be stuffing people in prisons because it's still talking tough on crime and on rioters and race rioters. So they're still coming in. They might be releasing, but they're going to be locking them up. They're going to hit that capacity very soon. Who's taking the hit? It will be prison. More importantly, it will be the prisoners themselves, or people who are in prisons. I don't use language. People who are in prisons. But then the language is a POA. So yeah, we're doing you a turn. And that's how they get that relationship.
Yeah.
That's the politics.
Yeah.
That's
Within
really
this
interesting
moment.
thinking about it like that. Because sometimes, like, when you see the kind of, like, chief of the prison officers and whatever on Channel 4 saying, like, this is unsustainable and whatever, I'm like, whose side are you on?
Yeah.
Like, I can't, like, I can't quite clock what's happening here. It feels slightly dystopian. Like, I can see a class analysis here as well. But equally, I don't think we're on the same side.
Yeah.
There's a resource argument going on there.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm reading. It's resources.
Yeah.
We want resources. We need this. We need more parva spray.
Yeah.
Our workers need more resource. We need more prison officers. It's a resource argument.
And also, like, locking people up in segregation. That's the other way to control. So we've got people locked up for 23 hours, which means there's less stress on the prison officer. But then I'm just wondering whether the next move is going to be, because they're also talking about the economy. This is 22 billion black hole, and, like, building is a way of, like, getting money running through the economy, and whether it will go back to, like, building more prisons as well. And then those prisons, then that becomes another space to like capture our bodies.
It feels logical, doesn't it, that we're going to build, but every government, how many governments, for as long as I've been doing this, subsequent governments have spoken about needing to build prison places. We've been forecasting 105 prison places for years. Every year there's that forecast. So I'm not sure how this will play out, but I think there is going to be a need to try and increase that capacity. That's a concern. But again, going back to that notion that the prison serves a symbolic function, well, where are all those people who are on the move being held? So where are those places, those other sites where people are confined and held against their will? Mental health institutions, asylum seeker centres. We're seeing a range of other spaces now, which in effect are prisons. Yeah, being developed and being used. And what the prison allows us to do is often diverts our attention from those more precarious spaces as well. Private companies who are running these institutions, who are not accountable to the state. And again, that's the purpose of this data and the criminal legal system itself. It distracts our attention from those harms that are taking place elsewhere. Probation hostels, care institutions,
Secure
care homes,
schools.
Secure schools. This is the sites within which that incarceration is taking place. Who is it? I think it's Raquan, and I don't want to big up that work, but that language of transcarceration becomes really important. That notion of the community and the prison almost meshing. We'll begin to move towards that incarceration within communities, through technological strategies as well. We're being sidetracked in these conversations away from those wider harms that are taking place. And I think, again, that's the urgency in terms of the work that we need to be doing and the ways in which we need to be thinking about this. But that takes community strategies. But it's our communities who are also within those spaces So how do we begin to surface these stories of harm that are taking place in order to build community resistance against these harms? And I think that becomes a key question here as well.
Yeah. Guys, this has been incredible. Before we wrap up, where is the hope?
I once spoke to I had this beautiful passing with an individual. I was in a taxi and I was asked, what do you do? And we were talking about the nature of the work I'm involved with. And he said something really profound to me. He said, listen, it's not our destiny to struggle. Oh. And there was something really beautiful and powerful in that moment that he gave me that blessing. It's not our destiny to struggle. And there's something really important in that moment to remind me that there's hope in our collective coming together and a recognition that it's not our destiny to struggle. That's where hope is, but it lies within community and us coming together to acknowledge and recognise that this isn't our destiny. And we shouldn't be using this discourse to frame who we are. It's about doing this work in order to demonstrate and present who we actually are, our authentic self. And I think there's something really important in that for me.
That's really beautiful.
That's beautiful. Citation, Patrick Williams. Yeah. It's not our destiny to struggle.
I can't take it. There's a brother in the taxi who gave it to me.
When we start it, we'll be like, Patrick was in the taxi with a brother who said this. Yeah. Rahil?
I'm going to read there's something I'm really annoyed about. The first time I mentioned this, first time I was on Surviving Society, and you said you read Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman, and you said it made you cry.
Yeah.
And I was annoyed with myself because I didn't, in that moment, follow up with you about why it made you cry.
Oh. You're asking me now?
I'm asking you now, yeah.
I think, well, I'm a very sensitive person, for one. And I think Wayward Lives was one of the first books I read that gave a kind of thick, detailed description of ordinariness, Black life, but also pain and struggle, and particularly of young Black girls. Writing through portraiture, so writing through ways that is attentive to the detail of the mundane, of the ordinary, it just gets me. It just gets me.
I can see, I can see now. Yeah. Can I just read a couple of lines from it? Just so this is one section and it's called Wayward, a short entry on the possible. Waywardness is a practice of possibility at a time when all roads, except the ones created by smashing out, are foreclosed. It obeys no rules and abides no authorities. It is unrepentant. It traffics in occult visions of other worlds and dreams of a different kind of life. Waywardness is an ongoing exploration of what might be. It is an improvisation with the terms of social existence when the terms have already been dictated, when there is little room to breathe, when you have been sentenced to a life of servitude, when the house of bondage looms in whatever direction you move. It's the untiring practice of trying to live when you were never meant to survive.
Thank you so much for sharing that from Saidiya Hartman, Wayward Lives. And I think just a kind of extension of that, and this is something that I read by Robbie Chillingham years ago now, but I use it in so much of my writing now, particularly about Black life in particular. We're looking for ordinary and dignified existences, considered lives, purposeful lives. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rahil. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Chantal. Thanks, George.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.